Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Pam, as well, for setting this whole thing up. I think this is a wonderful idea to have doc talks like this. And it's a great relationship between the city and the creative district. So keep it up. Keep doing it. That's wonderful. And thank you all for coming. I know many of you, and I really appreciate it as a personal favor for you to come here and listen to this doc talk and see what on earth happens. And I'm not sure what's going to happen, but we'll give it a try. At any rate, a century ago, 100 years ago, some 6,000 Greeley'ites showed up right in this vicinity, actually a block over at the train station, and that was more than half of the population of Greeley at that time. 11,000 people lived in Greeley at that time. 6,000 people showed up at the train station at one time. Probably wasn't enough room over there, so they probably were right in this vicinity where we are right now. They let school out that day so the kids could come. And why were they doing this? It was in order to welcome the train as it rolled into the station, bearing none other than General John J. Pershing, back from the war, back from the Great Wars, it was called, and the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in France. Let's see if I can get this thing working. There he is. That's what he looked like at about that time. And he was really a war hero, and people knew in Greeley, just as we know today, that war heroes sometimes become presidents. Think of Washington, think of Andrew Jackson, think of Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant. All of those were generals who turned their military success into political success. And since that time, we know that Dwight D. Eisenhower did it as well. So, John J. Pershing, maybe he could become President Pershing. You know, that was something. And people turned out in Greeley to find out what this guy really looked like and what he was all about, and maybe get a sort of preview of the next president in 1920, exactly a century ago. And I, as a historian, am really interested in trying to put myself into the mind of people who lived a while ago and don't happen to be living anymore, and seeing if I can connect with them, seeing if I can communicate with them. So the first thing I try to do in this doc talk is to imagine what those people in Greeley might have thought of this man that they are all turning out to see. And the first thing that comes to my mind is they probably thought of him as somebody somewhat familiar to them. He had been born in Laclede, Missouri, an agrarian town, not unlike Greeley, certainly back at the time that he was growing up. He was born in 1860. And they probably saw him as a kind of a kindred spirit. He'd gone to public school there, gone on into the military, as people from Greeley, many of them had done as well. And so they were probably looking for somebody who was a little bit like them that they could connect with in some way. They also saw him as having a special connection to this neck of the woods. Because he, right around Christmas time in 1903, had met and fallen in love, just really got a crush on, a gal who grew up just up the road that way in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And she was the daughter of the senator from Wyoming, Senator Frances Warren. And her name is Helen Frances Warren, and she grew up in Cheyenne. That's the senator that you see on the left. And then on the right, you see Pershing with 3 of his children. I'll get to that later. And there's Frankie. He always called her Frankie. And he was smitten by her, there's no doubt. And she by him as well. She was 20 years younger than he was. But they really hit it off. And so he would come back and forth through Greeley on the train as he visited Cheyenne, as he wooed her in 1904. And then they married in January 1905 in Washington, D.C. It was the biggest wedding of the year. The president, Theodore Roosevelt, and Mrs. Roosevelt, and their daughter Alice all attended. Senator Warren had many of his senatorial friends attending as well. It was a big deal. And so that is something that Greeleyites could be proud of because we're at least within the vicinity of Cheyenne. So that might be the first thing that they would think of him. He's a person that also would have really intrigued them. Because on the one hand, he was a man of great accomplishment, a hero, really, and not only the Great War, but also in previous wars, as we'll get into in a minute. But he also was a man who was, he had another side to him. He was very much a ladies' man. He was very much a kind of, he could be kind of a rake almost in some ways. You wouldn't ever think of this when you see his pictures, but he had that other side to him that was more of a private side. And so to the extent that here he is at West Point, graduating in 1886, he was senior captain of cadets, very accomplished. Then he goes off to Fort Wingate in New Mexico. And this is a picture of him in Fort Wingate in New Mexico. I don't know if you can pick him out. Does this have one of those? No, it doesn't. Okay. Well, he's in the foreground. Do you see him here? He's the only person in the picture with a cape. I don't know whether he thinks of him as himself as Superman, but there he is, and he's virtually surrounded by women. Out down here in a fort on the frontier in the United States. But there is Jack Pershing out there, and this, you get just sort of a sense of the other side of Pershing that was going on at that time, and indeed it was going on at that time, I can tell you. Well, after Wingate, he also has both of those sides at the University of Nebraska, and we have some people there from there, and there in Lincoln. And there, we all know him as the founder of what becomes the national organization, Pershing Rifles, and we have a Pershing rifle right among us here in yellow. Bob Stewart, none other. It becomes a national organization, starts out there at the University of Nebraska in the early 1890s, thanks to Pershing, and it is the model of spit and polished, disciplined, just perfection drill. But at the University of Nebraska, he was also known as the best dancer in the university. Pershing. So he has this really intriguing two sides to his character. After Nebraska, spent some time as a military instructor at West Point, and then went on and became a part of the American effort in the Spanish-American War, and we see him there. In San Juan, at Kettle Hill, going up to San Juan Heights. This is not him. This is Teddy Roosevelt, who takes all the credit, as you know, he and his Rough Riders, for that victory in 1898, July 1st, in San Juan Heights, Kettle Hill. But just to his left, if you look over there to his left, you'll see another unit, and those were, there they are. That was the 10th Cavalry, an African-American unit, and one of the officers for the 10th Cavalry was John J. Pershing. So he was right there at Kettle Hill, right next to Roosevelt, doesn't get any credit for it, but there he was with the African-American unit there. This wasn't his first time with that unit, the 10th Cavalry. He'd also officered with them in Montana back before he went to Nebraska, and he had had a very good experience with them at that time. When he went to West Point and became military instructor there, he was all spit and polish, all discipline. He was a tough guy, and the cadets didn't like him at all. And so they gave him the name, I won't use it, it's the N-word Jack. And that later gets sanitized into Black Jack Pershing. Now, that's how he gets it. And then he later is there in the Spanish-American War, also with the 10th Cavalry. They were also with him in Mexico when he was involved in the war in Mexico, the punitive expedition in 1916. And so he has a long history of working with African Americans, and that's how he got his name, Black Jack. Okay, so he's got kind of a heroic side to him. In 1899, the very next year, he goes off to the Philippines. This is part of the Philippine-American War. You might remember that had gotten started as we decided to make the Philippines into our colony in Asia so that we could have more trade with China and all of that. The war was mainly a war between Filipino people of the mainstream, most of whom were Roman Catholic, and took place mainly in the northern islands of the Philippine Islands. But Pershing didn't go there. He was, by chance, sent down, way down to the southern part of the islands, way down, if I can almost leap up here, just to the very tip of this arm of the island of Mindanao in the very southern Philippines, on a little town called Zamboanga there. And that area of the Philippines is where Muslims live, and Philippine Muslims are called Moros. Still keep that name even to this day. And that's where Pershing was. 1899, he gets there, and he'll stay there until 1903. And that's a formative period in his life, a very creative period in his life. I think it's the most important period in all of his life, even though it's not one that we know much about, because most of us think of Pershing just in the context of World War I. But that's what I write about. That's where he was. And he gets to know Moros there, or Muslims there, and that'll be very important, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But also, in the atmosphere of Zamboanga, this picture of Zamboanga, sleepy, laid-back, tropical town, very, very far from Victorian constraints of the United States itself. And this is where the other side of Pershing kind of comes out there. It's an exotic place, has beautiful, beautiful sailing vessels that ply the Sulu Sea. And many of the people, particularly there, the Bajaus, as they're called, live literally in houses out over the ocean. And Pershing was posted there, and here he is. See if you can find him in this picture. This is with the commanding general down there in Zamboanga in 1899-1900, who's General William Kobe, seated in the foreground. Pershing is, did you find him? Second from the left standing, looking very dashing and dapper there. He was among all the others who were there in Zamboanga, all these officers who all were bachelors, and they were in love very soon after they got there. In the case of Pershing, it was with Joaquina Landoy Ignacio. This is a picture of women in Zamboanga in 1900. I do not know if Joaquina is part of this, but I like to think that she's probably the one in the center seated. At any rate, he builds a house for her. They live together, and they have 2 children together. His son dies of the cholera. His daughter Petronilla, as she's called, lives on, and if you go to Zamboanga today, everybody in Zamboanga will be able to tell you exactly who is descended from Jack Pershing through Petronilla there. Pershing always denied this, because in 1900, 1902, right in that time that he was there, that was scandalous behavior. That was miscegenation in American life. He was a bachelor. He wasn't married. He was 39, 40 years old during that time, 41. We probably wouldn't see that as such scandalous behavior. I don't know, but I will speak for myself. But in those days, that was pretty bad, and he denied it. What bothers me about Pershing, and I'm a great admirer of him, is that he also denies paternity of Petronilla. That's a little harder to stomach, if you ask me. But at any rate, that is part of his life at that time. His commanding officers down there in Zamboanga see that he's getting in awfully deep here with Joaquina, and they get him out of that place, and they send him back home. And he gets back home in 1903, and that's where he meets Frankie. Oops, let me get back here. Whoa. Okay, not very good with this. There she is. So that's Frankie now with all of the 4 children. It's Helen in the foreground, and to her right, our left is Anne, and then Warren, his only son, named for the senator, is off on our right. And then little Mary Margaret, just 3 years old, is there with Frankie. And as I say, they get married in January 1905, and will live, quite happily for the next 10 years. People in Greeley who go to see the train then would be very interested in this intriguing person who has both the side of him of heroic military exploits and the side of him that makes him a little more personable, a little more understandable, a little more interesting, a little more scandalous, that other side as well. But by 1920, they'd also go to see this man because they would have empathy for him. Because by 1920, they knew, everybody in the United States knew, that he had suffered a terrible tragedy. He had suffered just a terrible, terrible tragedy. That had happened 5 years before, in 1915. Pershing had been on the border down in El Paso. He was posted there by President Wilson because the Mexican Revolution had really dissolved into a civil war at that point, and Americans were fearful that it would spread over into the border and into Texas, into New Mexico, and so posted American troops along the border, and Pershing was put in charge of those troops. Frankie was not there. Frankie and the children were left in San Francisco in the Presidio, which is the Army base outside of San Francisco, and they were put up in a ramshackle house there in the Presidio while Pershing was off on the border. And on August 26, 1915, that house caught fire. And they were all sleeping. And Frankie and all 3 of her daughters died of smoke inhalation that night before they could be saved. Warren was resuscitated. He had become unconscious, but they were able to save him. He was the only one who lived. Darn it. That's what the house looked like after the fire. I don't know what that arrow exactly means. It might be where Frankie was sleeping. But at any rate, Pershing was absolutely devastated, as you can imagine. And you can go up to Cheyenne, and in the municipal cemetery there today, and I would encourage you to do this, go and seek out, pay homage to the grave of Frankie and the 3 girls that's there. That's what the marker looks like. Pershing himself is buried at Arlington, so he is not with them, but the girls are there, and Frankie. Okay, certainly by 1920, another thing that would draw you to this man and make you show up for this moment in Greeley history is that he had certainly become a great person, a great personage. He was really seen as a sort of model for 20th century American military men. 2 of the great generals in 20th century American history, George Patton and George Marshall, were both aides to Pershing. And they both modeled their idea of a modern American military officer after Pershing. And you can see they're the kind of disciplined, spit and polish, straight backbone kind of man that they would admire. Other generals that we associate with American 20th century military history, like Douglas MacArthur, were also under him, but didn't model themselves quite as much as some did, like Marshall and Patton did. And so we would go to see him partly just because he's a great man, and we recognize that about him. But one of the things, look at that picture. One of the things you're going to see that different from this. This is taken before Frankie's death, and I didn't really know quite where to put this. I wanted to show you this to you, partly because it's Pershing with Pancho Villa. This is in early 1915, when Pancho Villa and Pershing were still negotiating, trying to work things out. In March of 1916, Pancho Villa goes across the border, raids Colombia, New Mexico. 20 Americans are killed in that raid, and suddenly Pershing is ordered to go into Mexico in a punitive expedition to try to track down Pancho Villa. And he does that all through 1916 into February 1917. But look at Pershing. He's smiling. You will never see a picture of Pershing smiling again. After Frankie's death, you'll never see it. He is just so dour and so serious. It just hit him to lose almost his whole family that way. It was such a tragedy. You'll never see a smiling Pershing again like that. At least I haven't in my work. Here he is getting to France in May of 1917. We have now gone to war with the German Empire, and he is appointed by President Wilson as commander of American forces, American expeditionary forces in France, and that's where he will be. And he will be the only American commander of those expeditionary forces until the war is over on November 11th, 1918. Think of how different that is than Civil War, where Lincoln has such a difficult time finding a commander, with McClellan not working out and so forth. Pershing will be the only American commander in World War I. He'll do it and do it well enough, maybe not brilliantly, but well enough so that he remains that commander through the war. Here he is with Marshal Foch, who is head of the Allied forces in the Great War. And you can see Pershing there and Foch. They didn't get along very well, but there they are nevertheless. And finally, when we go to see Pershing, 1920, we as Greeleyite, we go to see a war hero. Oh boy, is he a war hero. When he gets back in 1919, he's leading parades of American troops that are going through the streets of New York City in this case, or through Washington, D.C. He's just this great war hero on a gorgeous horse, by the way. I mean, that is just a beautiful horse that he's riding there. Okay, so I think we can put ourselves in the minds of people back in those days fairly easily without too much imagination. But I also like to imagine ways in which we today might be similar to people back in 1920, 100 years apart. But it seems to me we share a lot of things that are quite similar to people in those days. And I want to suggest a few of those to you, and I'll run through them very quickly. In 1920, they're recovering from the Great War. And that meant that 4.2 million American men are being demobilized. What's going to happen to the labor force? What's that going to mean for the labor market and salaries? All sorts of uncertainties as we wind down after the First World War. You and I, what are we recovering from? The Great Recession. And it's full of uncertainties, full of anxieties. We don't know what's going to happen, but we have been through the Great Recession and we have some doubts now. And last week, we watched the stock market take an incredible dive. Monday, it went up 1,200 points. Tuesday, it went down 800 points. Wednesday, it went up 1,200 points. Today, it went down 1,000 points. I mean, that kind of uncertainty and volatility gives us a sense of how people might have felt 100 years ago. I think we can connect there. Technology, dealing with the challenges of technology. I don't know about you, but that's a big challenge for me, including this. Okay, and computers and social media and all that kind of stuff. In those days, they're dealing with the new phenomenon of the family car. In 1920, maybe 1 out of 5 families in the United States has a family car. By the end of the decade, it's up to over half American families have a family car. Electrification of houses. By the 1920s, by the mid-1920s, about half of Americans have electricity in their house. That's a big deal. That's a really, really big deal, as you can imagine. And it takes maybe some getting used to when you're not out there in the family car enjoying your new mobility, physical, if not necessarily social or class. What about coronavirus? and the uncertainty we feel today. The equivalent in those days was the Spanish flu, the influenza. Well, I mean, the Spanish flu, the influenza, killed 675,000 Americans. Are we in for that? I mean, can you just imagine the kind of uncertainty and anxiety that would exist if that happened to us today? It killed at least 50 million people in the world. And some people estimate that it was even double that figure. Influenza is just an incredible thing to be fearful of. And we are today, they were then. The women's movement. In 1920, you have the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. Today, we have the ERA, we have the Me Too movement. Women are on the move, and we have that in both of our times. You have immigration. Immigration was a controversy then. In 1921, 1924, you have major anti-immigration legislation, first against Eastern Europeans, then against people from Asia, particularly Japanese. Immigration today, big, big controversy. We now know from some wonderful historical works that we tend to be more virulent regarding immigration, we as Americans, in times of uncertainty, and particularly of economic uncertainty. We tend to look for scapegoats, and that becomes a problem. It was a problem then, it's a problem now. In those days, you had urbanization. The census of 1920 shows that over half of Americans now live in urban areas. That's the first time ever in 1920 that was ever the case, that America always been a land of farmers, a land of rural agrarian areas like Laclede and Greeley. Now suddenly it's becoming an urban area. And you have the great migration of particularly African Americans coming from the South into the cities of the North. And all of a sudden you've got major sense of dislocation. Where are we going? What's happening here? The rise of the Ku Klux Klan. All of that is happening in the 1920s. What do we have like that today? Well, fortunately, nowhere near that kind of extremist sort of things. But there are more articles about neo-Nazis. There are more articles about people who are intolerant towards people who are different than themselves. That is certainly more and more issue that we have to deal with today. And so perhaps a little bit of similarity there. There's also that really interesting book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. Are you familiar with it? Which is documenting the decline of American institutions that we consider basic to American life, like mainstream churches, like service clubs, like Rotary and Kiwanis, that are having a hard time keeping their membership going, the Elks and other things, hard time. Americans, younger generation Americans particularly, just aren't in need of organizations like that as much as they used to be. What is that going to mean? Are we going to become a nation of bowlers alone, is what Putnam is suggesting. We're moving in that kind of direction and dealing with that. And a couple other things, and I'll just move on. But you could, I'm sure, come up with many other similarities between our experience and theirs. We've got Bernie Sanders today. He's a Democratic Socialist. 1920, there was a socialist who ran for president as well. Any of you know who that was? No, Robert La Follette was a progressive. He's not a socialist. But Eugene Debs was an avowed socialist. He's actually running for president from jail in Atlanta because he recommended and spoke volatilely and vocally to young American men during World War I, 1917, 1918, urging them not to join, not to allow themselves to be drafted, simply not engage in the conscription thing, even if it meant going to jail. And that broke the Sedition Act, act which was later found unconstitutional, as it should have been. And so he was thrown in jail for 10 years. That was later commuted. But he was there, and he got 3.4% of the electorate from jail.
Were they all prisoners?
I don't know, John, but that's a very interesting question. What I was thinking is that's better than I could do. You know, I don't know how Bernie will do. We'll see, but we have that similarity. And then just this morning, do you know that the motto, the slogan of the Republican candidate for president in 1920, Warren Harding, it was "Return to Normalcy." And I just heard this morning on TV that Joe Biden is promising a return to normalcy. So I don't know, do I make my case? I mean, if we just use our imagination a little bit, we really share quite a few things. Now, obviously, there are a zillion things where we're very, very different than people back in those days, from antibiotics to climate change to nuclear energy to flying anywhere in the world that we want to go. All sorts of things that we can find as differences. But the historian John Meacham, do you know his work? A nice book called The Soul of America. He divides American history into basically a cycle in which we have times when we follow our better angels, to use Lincoln's words, versus times when we follow our fears. And he finds, for example, that the Great Generation, the 1930s, 1940s, World War II, on into the 50s, that was a time when we followed our better angels. He argues that 1920 on up into through the 20s and 2020 are times of fear when we're following our fears. And so let me just lay this out to you just as an idea, thought. If you think of yourself, if you ask the question, I think it's a wonderful question, if I am part of a story, a larger story, what larger story am I part of? Well, one answer to that is that the modern age began with World War I, with the Great War. That's when so many things that have to do with modernization really began. Maybe the people in Greeley who showed up at the train station in 1920, maybe they were chapter 1 in that larger story. And maybe we're chapter 9 or 10. But we're part of the same story. And maybe we can really connect with people back then, and maybe if we try, we can make ourselves in some ways larger by having that connection with people who just happen to have lived before us. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to meet some of those people and actually talk with them? And wait. Oh my Lord. I think it's General Pershing. What? General Pershing. Well, would you welcome General Pershing? Oh. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been through Greeley a number of times on the train, going up there to Cheyenne, as Dr. Edgerton has mentioned. Never stopped here before. I have been told that the people of Greeley are very friendly people. To tell you the truth, friendly people make me nervous. Can't trust friendly people, that's been my experience, at least I'm not sure. But I am happy to tell you that since I've been here in Greeley in the last few minutes, people I've met haven't been very friendly at all. I'm so relieved. And now here I am. When I got off the train, the fellow who met me, he said, "We're going to go to Zoe's Cafe." Well, I just thought, oh my God, that's going to be a boisterous crowd of half-drunken people. What a pleasant surprise to find such sober people as you. This is one of the most sober group of people I've ever seen. And sobriety, I believe, is a true virtue. I think we should all follow. I appreciate it. And so thank you for being the sober people that you are. You're not friendly, are you? Okay, good. just to make sure we understand each other. One of the things, I don't want to be overcritical about the American political process today, but one of the things that I do think that you might be able to make a difference in is to give some sobriety to the American political process. It is running out of control, in case you haven't noticed. You have these political rallies where all these people show up for these political candidates of their choice. They have these signs that they wave, and they wear these uniforms, and they chant these chants, and they howl, and they create this great hubbub for the candidate that they love, and they hiss and they boo against the candidate that they do not like. This is not decorum. This is not the way we did it back in 1920. And you could learn something from us about that decorum. And I will tell you that the candidates today, they are encouraging this kind of behavior. Yes, they're supposed to stand behind a podium and speak to their people. Instead, they come out from behind the podium and they shake people's hands. I'm not going to do that, don't worry. They put their arm around people. They clap people on the back. They kiss babies who have no relationship to them at all. And then, worst of all, you have begun this new practice. All you people out there in the crowd, of taking your cameras and turning them around. And instead of taking pictures of the Rocky Mountains or the sunset or the sunrise or even of the candidate, you take them of yourself. They're called selfies. It's become a selfie nation, and I would suggest that that is not a good thing. You can quote me on this, my campaign slogan. Less selfies, more service. That's what Americans need. Maybe a little more self-sacrifice and a little less selfies. Yes, but there the people are, and there the candidates are, and they're taking selfies of each other, and it's just a disgrace. And it is far and far and far from the sobriety that you all represent to me tonight. Then there are the primaries. You've got to do something about the primaries. Are you aware that there are primaries going on all the time? You can't open the newspaper. Well, I realize people aren't reading the newspaper anymore. You can't turn on the radio. Well, I realize people aren't listening to the radio. Whatever you're doing, any way you connect with things, you're hearing about the primaries. Every Tuesday, every Saturday, there's a primary. People can't go to work anymore. You can't do errands on the weekends. You can't go to the office because you've got to deal all the time with the primaries. There must be a more efficient way to do things. Now, having said that, I will admit that I have tossed my hat in the ring, as we say, for the Nebraska primary on April 20th, 1920. And, well, I am not running for president. I want you to know that. We do not run for president in 1920. No. People come to us. I have always served my nation, and I will continue to serve my nation. And if the American people want me to be president, I will serve in the White House. But I will not run for president. Your people today who are candidates, they run for president for year after year after year. This fellow you've got in the White House right now, this Trump fellow, he's been running for president since not 2016, and he's been president that long, and he's still running. I want you to understand that when I criticize your president today, I am a lifetime Republican. A lifetime Republican. Always have been, always will be. I'll never vote for a Democrat. I divide the Democratic Party between two factions. In the North, communists. In the South, Confederates. You get communists and Confederates together, and what have you got? Catastrophe. That's the problem with the Democratic Party. You can't depend on them. No, you've got to be a Republican. Republicans have got stiff backbones, good order, decorum, And yes, they are people that you can depend on. But this fellow you've got in the White House right now, he has personally insulted me, and I do take umbrage at that. I don't know what it is about him why he attacks me. I lived 100 years ago, for heaven's sake. But he argues that I committed a terrible atrocity when I was there in the Philippines. Remember, I got there in 1899, I was there until 1903, then I came back in 1909 and stayed as military governor of Moros until 1913. A total of 7, 8 years. I fought, pacified, governed Muslims at that time. This is the first time that Americans had ever encountered militant Islam, and I was right there at the forefront of it. And your president claims that at one point I took 50 Moro prisoners, lined them up in a row, and then took 49 American soldiers, lined them up across from them, and then had ordered those American soldiers to shoot those Moros in cold blood. And shot down 49 of those, and then sent the 50th Moro out to tell his people this would happen to all of them if they didn't quit fighting the Americans in their insurgency as they tried to keep us from colonizing their part of the Philippines. And then, as though that isn't bad enough, your president is saying that it worked. And I so scared the Moros that they stopped fighting, and that was it. And he's suggesting that that's exactly how Muslims ought to be treated today. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I take great pride in the fact that I have never been associated with an atrocity. I never engaged in atrocities. I, in fact, took the orders of President Roosevelt and later President Wilson in making sure that there were no such atrocities. And I will tell you that I have figured up in my time fighting Muslims in the Philippines, I spent 4 hours talking with them, negotiating with them, for every hour I spent even fighting with them. And that's what I'm going to suggest you might think about doing in your counterinsurgency efforts in the world today. And so I will say that I think I am being very poorly represented in this story that your president continues to. There's not a shred of truth to it. And I'm happy that Dr. Edgerton, I don't know where he went, but I am very happy that he has indicated this in this book that he is coming out with. While the book is not here, there are some cards over there that perhaps you'll choose to pick up. It's called American Datu, and it refers to me as the American Datu because I worked so closely with Moro leaders who are called Datus, or chiefs, that they elected me as one of their chiefs, as one of their Datus. I wonder if there will be any Afghan Muslim who will favor naming one of the American officers Datu in the equivalent way. Well, I know that Dr. Edgerton has much to tell you about this kind of thing. I know that my train is about to leave, and so I am going to bid farewell to you right now. Thank you for being an attentive audience. I now will leave you and let Dr. Edgerton take over from here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, that was a surprise. Well, okay. Thank you for being an attentive audience, as he said. I'm sure he was very honored. I want to share with you something you may not be aware of. It's a shame, but the general did go into the primary in Nebraska in April of 1920, and he lost. he lost. Even though he was the favorite son, he had adopted Nebraska as his, Lincoln, Nebraska as his new home. And he was running against two people who were not from Nebraska. Leonard Wood, a general that he disliked intensely, and Hiram Johnson, a senator from California. They both got more votes than Jack Pershing in Nebraska. I don't know what you have to say about that, but it's pretty bad. But at any rate, that was the end of it. He came in third in his home state. Does that sound familiar? Elizabeth Warren. And just as Elizabeth Warren today has dropped out, so Jack Pershing dropped out of the presidential race in 1920, and we got Warren Harding instead, and a return to normalcy and corruption, and that's a little editorializing there, but okay. Well, the general did, just before he left, he wanted me to read something that he had written, and he had published this in McCall's magazine in 1927, November 1927. McCall's magazine, a wonderful magazine, particularly for women. It was geared for women. And this is Dear War Mothers by General Pershing. In the article, he doesn't just really write it for war mothers, Gold Star mothers. He writes it for all women, and I thought I'd just read this one very short passage of his own words from 1927. If lawlessness, wastefulness, and corruption exist in government, woman must take her share of the blame. Okay? You have suffrage now, so with that comes responsibility. Thank you. Control yourself, John. That's all. If officials in legislative and administrative positions are demagogues or charlatans, the fault lies with the citizens of America themselves, men and women. A government can be no better than the average of its citizenship. True patriotism, listen to this, is not confined to times of war, but is an everyday principle of political life. True patriotism is an everyday principle of political life. Pershing really, really believed in citizenship, in patriotism, in preparedness, and those kinds of things. And that's what he stood for all the rest of his life until his death in 1948. But what he would really want me to tell you about is the most creative time in his life. And so the last part of this evening, I would like to share with you and engage you in a discussion of his ideas about counterinsurgency warfare that he came up with 120 years ago, and compare those with some ideas that we have today. And you might say, why are you doing this? How does this relate to me? Well, the United States has been engaged in, just think of how many wars that are euphemistically called small wars since World War II. And by that, it's generally meant, well, they're not world wars, and so they must be small. Okay, and so we've got the Korean War, and we've got the Vietnam War, hardly a small war, and we've got Iraq, and we've got Afghanistan, and we've got our deployment in Somalia, and you've got troops, American troops, all over the world today. What should we be doing with those troops? How should we deal with people who are engaged against us in wars that we find ourselves deployed in? How should the military approach its effort to do that? When I was doing my research, I was at the military archives in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and I met a guy by the name of Conrad Crane, and he is one of the co-authors of this book on the Counterinsurgency Manual, which is the new manual which came out in 2006 for the Army and the Marine Corps on how best to fight counterinsurgency wars or small wars today anywhere in the world. And we're engaged in so many of them today, mainly against Muslims, as it happens, just as Pershing was 120 years ago. This is a good book. This is very, very sophisticated. They have very good ideas on how to fight small wars. David Petraeus led the way in getting this done. And he was in charge of the American effort in Afghanistan in 2010 to late 2011, almost into 2012. That's when the ideas in this manual were most fully implemented at that time. But to some extent, they've been implemented through much of our effort in Afghanistan, also to some extent in Syria, and also even in Iraq to some extent. Well, how does that compare with this fellow in the archives told me, why don't you write about Pershing and the extent to which his ideas were a precursor to what we're trying to do today, and to what extent they were different, to what extent they were alike. What might he have to tell us today in what has got to be an important issue for every American? How do you fight these wars? How do you best deploy your soldiers, your man and womanhood, your blood, your treasure in all these wars? So I want to hand out, if I could, do we have the handouts? First, and I'll just cover these real quickly because I want to have time to discuss this with you. Oh, there they are over there. Okay. Counterinsurgency methods, Pershing's progressive counterinsurgency, that's what I call it, against the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual that came out in 2006. And what you'll find, you should be getting 2 sheets. Is that, you got, no, there are 4 sheets in all. Did we get them all?
Oh, I see.
The first sheet is just says counterinsurgency methods. If you get that, I'll wait until everybody gets a copy. Okay. I'm looking at the first sheet, which says condensed from the field manual. Do you see where I'm at there? And then it just lists some other things. So I would recommend that you do spend some time taking a look at this. I think it's very good advice. It's all about the people. Every counterinsurgent should ask, what have you done for the people today? You should do that every day. It's the lowest common denominator. There's a political struggle going on. It's not just military. It requires depth of knowledge. Pershing is a model of that. He tried to learn the language of the people. He spent so much time with them, studied the religion, the culture of the Moro people in the Philippines, got to know them very, very well, made very good friends with them. At one point, even gifted as a gift to one of the datus there, the chiefs there that he had become a member of, a copy of the Quran, because they didn't have access to that. And so he had that sense of respect for their culture and their religion. Local. It's not that one part of Afghanistan, I've got a map here of Afghanistan, is the same as another part. It's very, very different. You've got to localize everything that you do. Requires unity of effort between military and civilians, between different parts of an effort, any effort to govern and work with people. Flexibility. Small is beautiful. Asymmetry is one of the main banes of warfare by Americans because we have so much power and we have so much money. And if we use it, that's asymmetrical, and that tends to corrupt the local political leaders. It tends to, for example, in Afghanistan, one of our main warlords that was supporting us because he's opposed the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Taliban, we were giving him $100,000 a month. That just kind of thing is just asking for corruption. It's a total asymmetrical kind of situation. It's better if you don't have as much, forcing you to work with people in smaller units and do that kind of thing. Protracted warfare, yes, it's going to last for a while. And then on the page 2, number 9, it's a 3-step process. This is what the manual says. Pershing would completely agree. First you clear, that's the military stage, that's the war-fighting stage. Secondly, you hold, that's when you try to build a society that has roads and bridges and schools and clinics. And then you truly build a society that will last by educating the populace, by bringing in democracy, by making for a nation that you help to build. Okay, that's what you find in the manual. On the second sheet, you'll see what Pershing would recommend and how his is different than that. And you'll see that he agrees generally on 8 2/3 of the 10 points. He doesn't agree on the politics side of things. He was never a politician, as you know. He didn't believe in politics. He thought that was a corrupting kind of thing. And so the military's job should be military. It should fight. And it should not get involved in politics. So he disagreed on that. And then on that 3-part triptych that I just listed, you're supposed to clear, you're supposed to hold, you're supposed to build. He agrees completely. The military clears. It beats them in war fighting. It defeats the enemy. And then it builds a society, it doesn't build, it holds a society to the point where there's a degree of sustainability and stability. And then it gets the hell out and goes home. It does not engage in nation building. In that sense, Pershing would disagree with what we're doing in Afghanistan today completely. And so on the very last page, where you've got 2 columns, I'm asking you your opinion on what you think we ought to do today. Should we follow the Pershing approach, or should we follow what is just generally called COIN today? C-O-I-N, that's just shorthand for counterinsurgency warfare today. Pershing's argument, progressive counterinsurgency, on the left-hand column, is that American ideas about counterinsurgency warfare today, COIN, that's unrealistic. You can't create a legitimate government for other people. We tried to do it in Vietnam. We've tried to do it in Afghanistan. You can't do that as foreigners. That's got to be something that people do themselves. There are limits to what Americans can do and what the American military can realistically achieve. And that takes us to point 2 under the Pershing approach. The military business should be military. Focus on clearing and holding, not on building, and respect the host culture's leaders, even though you don't agree with them, even though they're going against the things that you hold dear. For example, democracy and rights for women. These are patriarchs, and they don't believe in rights for women. Pershing says we've got to live with that. We're there to fight al-Qaeda, we're there to fight ISIS, we're there to fight the Taliban if necessary. We're not there to nation build a new society. COIN, therefore, is unrealistic for the American home front. You can't expect Americans to give unending support. 18 years, 19 years now in Afghanistan, we have spent $1 trillion. That's $1 million times $1 million. $1 million times $1 million. In Afghanistan alone. We have spent $133 billion on nation building in Afghanistan. That is more inflation adjusted than all the money we spent on the Marshall Plan for all of Europe after World War II. And that's just for Afghanistan. What can you expect from the American people? Just endless? Totally endless? And the leaders of the counterinsurgency effort today in the American military would respond. Pershing's approach fails to acknowledge the central fact of counterinsurgency warfare. Political struggle is 80% of the total effort. If you cannot build a legitimate government in the eyes of the people, you will lose, even though you win every battle. And number 2, if you collaborate with the old patriarchal leaders who have lost legitimacy, you are doing violence not only to the local society's oppressed people who count on you, but to your own values. And 3, be honest and upfront with the American people, and they will support you. In a protracted war, look at how long we supported American military presence in South Korea. Well, it is a tough, tough thing. It really is. I'll just give you a couple pictures here. Those guys would represent the patriarchal leaders that Pershing would recommend that we have to work with because they are co-enemies of our enemy, the Taliban, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. These guys don't want them any more than we do. Work with them. But those guys also don't want democracy, they don't want reform, they don't want women's rights. And so are you going to work with them? Or on the Cohen side, are you going to care about these gals? That picture just breaks my heart every time I look at it. Came out in the Washington Post in December, and you just look at those faces, and your heart goes out to them. You want to help them. So where do you stand? Would you favor the Cohen approach, which is really protracted war, $133 billion in nation building, endless involvement probably, but for a good cause? Or is it the role of the American military to fight wars and then go home? Even if it means that the end result there is not necessarily something you want. Just by way of conclusion, I'd just like to suggest that I think that the whole point of education, whether you're at the elementary level or college level, is to educate people so that they can connect with other people who are not necessarily like them, whether they're different in culture or religion or gender or age, generational, whether they're different in race, ethnicity. And what historians do in that whole general effort to help us to connect with a broader public is to connect across time. It doesn't just matter, we shouldn't let it matter that a person happens to have died. We should still try to connect and understand and try to bring them to life in some ways. That's what I've tried to do tonight. If I succeeded in the slightest bit, I will be very happy. Thanks for your attention.